Good morning. I'm Roland Kuschel, and it's my pleasure to introduce you to one of the many memorable speakers who addressed OSHER's summer lecture series over the past 4 or 5 years. Today's presentation by Professor Stephen Levitsky, entitled Government Dysfunction and the Future of Our Democracy, was part of our 2016 series. The theme of our series that year was Our Divided Country, How to Find Common Ground. We think you will find it as informative and current as it was when first given to the in Spalding Auditorium. Stephen Levitsky has been a professor of government at Harvard University since 2000. As a political scientist, his research interests focus on political parties and systems, authoritarianism, and democratization. Professor Levitsky received his BA from Stanford University in 1999 and a PhD from the University of California, Berkeley in 2000. In 2018, he published How Democracies Die with fellow Harvard professor Daniel Ziblatt. The book examines the conditions that can lead democracies to break down from within rather than due to external factors such as military coups or foreign invasions. In his lecture, Professor Levitsky examines the polarization of the American electorate in recent elections, which has raised serious questions about the fate of our democracy. As in his book, he examines how perceptions of unfairness and dysfunction, be it due to income inequality, race issues, immigration, and so on, which have made democracies such as ours more vulnerable to a slide toward authoritarianism. Here is Dr. Levitsky.
Wow. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, first of all, to the OSHER Lifelong Learning Institute, and particularly Pete and John. It's a real honor to participate in the 22nd annual summer lecture series. I'm glad we cleared that up. So it's a lovely day outside, and my job is to depress the hell out of you. So I'm going to try to do in the next 45 minutes. So, you hear me okay? In the back? Donald Trump's election raised a question that Daniel, my co-author, and I never thought that we'd ask. Could American democracy be in danger? Like the vast majority of Americans, we had always taken the stability of our democracy for granted. And there was good reason for this. No democracy, even remotely as rich or as old as our democracy, has ever broken down. Political scientist Daniel Treisman recently did a statistical analysis that compared the odds of a democratic breakdown in the United States relative to other classic democratic failures like Weimar Germany or Chile in the 1970s. He found that based on its age and its wealth, the United States is 1/35th as likely as Weimar Germany to suffer a breakdown, and 1/134th as likely to suffer a breakdown as Chile in 1972. So statistically speaking, U.S. democracy seems pretty safe. And yet Trump's election seemed to place us in uncharted territory. In his classic book, The Breakdown of Democratic Regimes, the Spanish political scientist Juan Linz, who taught for many years at Yale, devised what he called a litmus test for authoritarian behavior. And we present kind of a revised version of that litmus test in our book. Donald Trump tested unambiguously positive on this litmus test. He suggested that he might not accept the results of the election. He threatened legal action against critics in the media. He threatened to lock up his opponent, and he condoned and even encouraged violence. No major party presidential candidate in modern American history had ever behaved in that way. But Daniel and I had seen this kind of behavior before. Daniel and his research on Europe in the interwar years, me and my research on Latin America. Watching the 2016 campaign unfold gave both of us the feeling that we'd seen this movie before, and it's a movie that doesn't end well. So we decided to write a book. I want to summarize the main arguments of the book here, and then hopefully we'll have time to for some discussion after the cookie break. One logistical question: does the speaker get a cookie in the cookie break? Yes? Only if he does a good job. Okay. Okay, so how do democracies die? They don't die like they used to. Democracies used to die at the hands of men with guns. During the Cold War, for most of the 20th century, 3 out of 4 democratic breakdowns took the form of a classic military coup. The general seized power. Contemporary democracies die in a much more subtle way. They die not at the hands of generals, but at the hands of elected presidents and prime ministers, leaders who use the very institutions of democracy to subvert it. So contemporary democracies die constitutionally. They die through elections, through referenda, through laws and Supreme Court rulings. As a result, because of this, many citizens are not fully aware that their country is sliding into authoritarianism until it's too late. In 2011, 12 years into Hugo Chávez's presidency in Venezuela, surveys showed that a good-sized majority of Venezuelans still believed that they were living under a democracy. The same is true today in Turkey, Hungary, Poland, the Philippines. So if democratic breakdown today begins at the ballot box, not in the barracks, one of the keys to protecting democracy is in keeping extremists and demagogues from getting elected in the first place. And here political parties play a crucial role. Parties are democracy's gatekeepers because they're the ones who select the candidates. They have the power, more than anybody else in society, to keep extremists out. Elected authoritarians rarely come to power on their own. Almost always they get help, they get a hand, an assist from mainstream parties and politicians. Mainstream political parties sometimes are tempted to strike kind of a Faustian bargain with popular demagogues. They align with them, they work with them, they flirt with them in the hope of tapping into their popular support, but always in the belief that ultimately, at the end of the day, they can control them. But this bargain often backfires. In Italy in the 1920s, liberal leader Giovanni Giolitti, seeking to tap into Mussolini's mass appeal, included the fascists on his mainstream party's ticket for parliament, his party list for parliament. In Weimar, Germany, the leader of the German Conservative Party forged a loose alliance with Hitler in the late 1920s, trying to draw on Hitler's grassroots appeal to shore up his party's declining base. A few years later, when conservative leader Franz von Papen tried to ease the concerns of fellow conservatives after Hitler's appointment as chancellor, von Papen told them, "Don't worry, within 2 months we'll have pushed him into a corner so much that he'll squeal." In both cases, this turned out to be a tragic miscalculation. Now, historically, American parties have done a really good job of gatekeeping. The United States has had no shortage of popular demagogues: Father Coughlin, Henry Ford, Huey Long, Joe McCarthy, George Wallace. Surveys suggest that every one of the figures I just named enjoyed at some point 35% approval rating, not far from Donald Trump's approval rating when he was elected. But none of those figures made it even close to the White House. How were they kept out? Mostly through the candidate selection process. Prior to 1972, as you all know, our presidential candidates were selected by party leaders during the convention, what we often think of as a smoke-filled back room. That system, what we had prior to 1972, was not very transparent. It wasn't very democratic, but it was a pretty effective filtering mechanism. Party leaders on both sides served as gatekeepers. They engaged in what political scientists at the time called a process of peer review. Party leaders had worked with most of these candidates. They knew their strengths, they knew their weaknesses, they knew how the potential candidates dealt with stress and adversity, and they knew which one of them were potential demagogues. In fact, for all of its shortcomings, and there were many real shortcomings, the old convention system had a perfect record, 100% perfect record in keeping demagogues out. Under the old system, it was essentially impossible for a demagogue like Henry Ford to be nominated for the presidency. So most of them didn't even try. How many of you have read Philip Roth's book, The Plot Against America? More of you should read it. It's a good book. In that novel, Charles Lindbergh, a Nazi sympathizer, captures the 1940 Republican nomination and goes on to beat FDR and win the presidency. Things take a downhill turn from there. The book sold like hotcakes after Trump's election because suddenly that crazy story seemed all too real. But back in 1940, that was basically unthinkable. It was fantasy. Lindbergh's candidacy would never have made it through the party gatekeepers. It would never have made it out of the smoke-filled rooms. So what happened in 2016? Two things. First of all, American parties adopted a system of binding primaries in 1972. Our primary system today is far more open, far more democratic than the old convention system. But it has weakened party leaders' role as gatekeepers. So now when a demagogue runs for office, it is much, much harder for party leaders to keep him out. And that's what we saw in 2016. Whereas party gatekeepers once systematically kept out outsiders like Charles Lindbergh and Henry Ford, kept them far from the White House, Trump found the gates wide open. Democrats should think hard about that fact as they consider proposals to eliminate superdelegates in their own party. Superdelegates are gatekeepers. Now, after Trump's nomination, Republican gatekeepers failed a second time. Spanish political scientist Juan Linz, the guy who came up with the original litmus test, devoted most of his career to studying how democracies die. And one of the key lessons that he drew, particularly from studying the collapse of democracy in interwar Europe, was that mainstream political parties, mainstream politicians have to do everything possible, everything within their reach to keep would-be authoritarians away from the center of power. And when necessary, they must be willing to join forces with their political rivals in defense of democracy. Republicans advocated that gatekeeping function in 2016. Now, resisting a demagogue on one's own side of the political spectrum, in one's own party, is hard. It risks angering the base, and it often means short-term political defeat, and no politician likes to lose. So politicians often rationalize. They tell themselves, well, the demagogue might not be that bad. They tell themselves they can control the demagogue, and that at the end of the day, it's better than handing power to your rivals. Again, this is a terrible mistake. Linz made this point forcefully. He wrote, when faced with a would-be authoritarian, politicians must, and I quote, join with opponents ideologically distant, but committed to the survival of the democratic political order. Now, some Republicans did exactly that in 2016. Listen to what 3 Republican politicians said during the 2016 campaign. Republican number 1, our choice this election could not be more clear. Hillary Clinton is a strong and clear supporter of American democracy. Donald Trump is a danger for our democracy. Republican number 2, it's time to put country before party and vote for Secretary Clinton. Trump is too dangerous and too unfit for office to hold our nation's highest office. Republican 3, this is serious stuff, and I won't waste my vote on a protest candidate. Since the future of the country may depend on preventing Donald Trump from becoming president, I'm with Clinton this November, and I urge Republicans to join me. Now, had those 3 statements been made by Paul Ryan, Mitch McConnell, and former President George Bush, or perhaps a trio of prominent senators, say McCain, Rubio, and Cruz, the outcome of the 2016 election would have been very different. But those statements were not made by 3 prominent Republicans. They were made by William A. Pierce, the former press secretary of retired Maine Senator Olympia Snowe, Jack McGregor, a former state senator from Pennsylvania, and Rick Stoddard, a Republican banker from Denver. Ryan, McConnell, Rubio, and Cruz all endorsed Trump. McCain withdrew his endorsement but refused to endorse Clinton. George W. Bush remained silent. Republican leaders knew, and they said it repeatedly in private, they knew that Donald Trump was a demagogue. They knew damn well he was unfit for office. But no major Republican leader was willing to do the one thing that would have ensured Trump's defeat, and that is endorse Hillary Clinton. Not a single prominent Republican official, elected Republican official, endorsed Clinton. No governors, no senators, only one member of the House of Representatives, and he was retiring. That fact sent a crucial message to Republican voters. It told Republican voters that Trump was an acceptable candidate and that this was just a normal election. In the context of a so-so economy, middling presidential popularity, a normal election, a standard two-party race in this country, can go either way. It was likely to be close, and it happened to go Trump's way. So now we have a sitting president today with a demonstrably weak commitment to constitutional and democratic norms. Now, this is where our institutions come into play. Americans place a lot of faith in our Constitution, and for pretty good reason. We have the oldest, we have the most successful Constitution in the world. And our system of checks and balances has, in fact, contained many powerful and ambitious presidents in the past. Andrew Jackson, FDR, Nixon. So why shouldn't it contain Trump? It might. But even brilliantly designed constitutions by themselves are not enough to protect a democracy. If the Constitution, if what was written down on paper were sufficient to protect us, then Argentina, whose constitution was modeled explicitly on the United States Constitution, should have been a stable democracy in the 20th century. Instead, it suffered 6 military coups. Constitutions are not self-enacting. They don't just work automatically. They've got to be reinforced by strong democratic norms or unwritten rules. And our book focuses on 2 norms in particular. One is what we call mutual toleration, or accepting the legitimacy of one's partisan opponents. That means that no matter how much we may disagree with our opponents, no matter how much we may personally dislike our opponents, we recognize both publicly and in private that our opponents are loyal citizens who love the country just as much as we do and who have an equal and legitimate right to run against us and, if they beat us, to govern the country. In other words, we do not treat our rivals as enemies. The second norm, a little more complicated, is what we call institutional forbearance. Forbearance means refraining from exercising one's legal right. It's an act of self-restraint. It is an underutilization of one's power. Now, we don't often think about forbearance in politics, but it is absolutely essential. Think about what the United States president is constitutionally, legally able to do. The president, as we know, can pardon whomever she wants, whenever she wants. Any president with a majority in Congress can pack the Supreme Court. Don't like how the Supreme Court is ruling, don't like the ideological composition of the court. If you've got a majority in Congress, expand it to 11, expand it to 13, fill it with ideological allies. Perfectly legal. Or if a president's agenda is stalled in Congress, he or she can circumvent the legislative process and make a lot of policy through presidential proclamations and other forms of executive decree. The Constitution does not explicitly prohibit that action. Or think about what Congress can do. The Senate can use its right of advice and constraint, its constitutional right of advice and consent, to block all the president's cabinet picks, to block all the president's court picks. It can prevent the president from filling Supreme Court seats. Congress can refuse to fund the government. It can shut the government down for an extended period of time, for any period of time. And, of course, it can impeach the president basically on any grounds that it chooses. My point here is that politicians can exploit the letter of the Constitution or the gaps in the Constitution in ways that clearly eviscerate its spirit. Legal scholar Mark Tushnet calls this kind of behavior, using the letter of the law to undermine the spirit of the law, he calls it constitutional hardball. Look at any failing or failed democracy around the world and you will find an abundance of constitutional hardball. Spain and Germany in the 30s, Argentina under Perón, Venezuela under Hugo Chavez, contemporary Poland, Hungary, Turkey, Philippines. Let me give you one example, a country that I work on, Argentina. Again, Argentina's 1853 Constitution was modeled explicitly on the U.S. Constitution. One study found that 2/3 of the Argentine Constitution was an exact replica, basically plagiarized from the U.S. Constitution. But Perón used that very Constitution to undermine Argentine democracy. One of the first moves he made after becoming president in 1946 was to have the Congress impeach 3 out of 5 Supreme Court justices on grounds of malfeasance. That move technically was constitutional. The Peronist Congress then passed a law that made it a crime to disrespect the president, to speak fake news against the president. When opposition leader Ricardo Balbín was arrested under this new law, because he's the opposition leader, he criticized the president, that was considered disrespectful, he was put in jail. He challenged the constitutionality of the law in the courts, made sense. The packed Supreme Court upheld the law. Again, technically legal. What prevents a system of checks and balances like ours from being wrecked by constitutional hardball is forbearance. It's a shared commitment among our politicians to institutional restraint, to upholding the spirit of the law above and beyond the letter of the law. A couple of examples. Think about presidential term limits historically in the United States. Prior to 1951, first 150 years of our history, the U.S. Constitution placed no limit on presidential reelection. American leaders could have been president for life, like Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. But for nearly 150 years, following a precedent set by Washington, no president sought a third term. It was not that the Constitution prevented presidents like Jackson, like Grant, from seeking a third term. It was a norm of forbearance. It was an unwritten rule rather than the written Constitution that did it. Or take the filibuster. Technically, a Senate minority can use the filibuster to obstruct every single move that the majority makes. But historically, in the United States, the filibuster was used very rarely in the Senate. It was treated as a procedural weapon of last resort. In fact, the Senate recorded an average of less than 1 filibuster per year between 1917 and 1960. Senators exercised restraint. They exercised forbearance. Daniel and I argue that norms, on the one hand, of mutual toleration, and on the other hand, of forbearance, serve as the soft guardrails of democracy. They are what prevent healthy political competition from spiraling into the kind of partisan fight to the death that wrecked democracies in Europe in the 1930s and in South America in the 1960s and 70s. Now, the U.S. hasn't always had these soft guardrails. We didn't have them in the early years of the Republic. In the 1790s, Hamilton and other leaders of the ruling Federalist Party viewed the Jeffersonian opposition as seditious. They attacked Jefferson's Republicans as traitors who were secretly working for France. For their part, the Republicans viewed the Federalists as, and called them this, monarchists who were conspiring to restore British rule. Constitutional hardball on both sides, the Federalists and the Republicans, nearly wrecked the Republic in the 1790s and the early 1800s. 1798, as many of you know, the Federalists passed the Sedition Act, which came close to outlawing opposition. After Adams lost the presidency in 1800, the lame duck Federalist Congress stole a Supreme Court seat from incoming President Thomas Jefferson. And once the Republicans were in power, after 1800, they packed the court twice and tried to impeach a Federalist Supreme Court justice who had opposed Jefferson. It really was not until after the Founding Fathers' generation had left the political scene in the 1820s, in the 1830s, that norms of mutual toleration and forbearance really took hold. They didn't last very long. In the 1850s, a couple decades later, Southern Democrats came to view the emerging anti-slavery Republican Party as an existential threat, as an enemy. Georgia Senator, Democrat Robert Coombs vowed, and I quote, to never permit this federal government to pass into the traitorous hands of the Black Republican Party. In the late 1850s, politics took on an anything-goes character. One historian counts 125 different acts of violence on the floor of Congress: fistfights, canings, stabbings, people whipping out pistols in the years prior to the Civil War. Mutual toleration, democracy broke down during the Civil War, and mutual toleration between the parties remained low for nearly a generation after the Civil War. During Reconstruction, 1860s, 1870s, Republicans treated Southern Democrats as traitors, and Southern Democrats continued to view the Republicans as an existential threat, as a threat to their way of life. And the Reconstruction era was replete with constitutional hardball. Changes to the size of the Supreme Court in 1866 and 1869, the impeachment of President Johnson in 1868, a fraudulent election in 1876. Norms of mutual toleration and restraint are the democratic norms that we've had over the last 100-plus years really only took hold in the late 19th century. And crucially, they took hold after the Republicans abandoned the goal of racial equality and allowed Southern Democrats to disenfranchise blacks and to establish Jim Crow and single-party authoritarian rule throughout the South. Once the Republicans had backed off the goal of racial equality, once they had abandoned Reconstruction, Democrats stopped viewing them as an existential threat, as a threat to their way of life, and the two parties began to accept one another. This is an important point. The norms of mutual toleration and forbearance that would go on to serve as a foundation for the democracy that we grew up under emerged out of a profoundly undemocratic arrangement: racial exclusion and the establishment of single-party rule in the South. Keep this point in mind going forward. For now, note that in the beginning in the late 19th century, 1880s, 1890s, norms of mutual toleration took root, and politicians from both parties began to act systematically with forbearance, refraining from egregious acts of constitutional hardball. There were no impeachments. There were no successful court packings. Senators were judicious in their use of the filibuster, in their exercise of the right of advice and consent on presidential appointees. The Senate generally deferred to the president on Supreme Court picks. And again, there were fewer than one filibuster per year between World War I and the Kennedy administration. Presidents also used forbearance. Outside of wartime, they refrained from acting unilaterally at the margins of Congress or the Supreme Court. There were occasional violations and abuses. Franklin Roosevelt tried to pack the court in 1937. In the early 50s, McCarthyism really assaulted norms of mutual toleration. And of course, Nixon's illegal efforts to undermine his Democratic opponents not only violated democratic norms, but broke the law. But in each of these cases, bipartisan coalitions successfully defended democratic norms. Roosevelt's court-packing scheme failed. It failed because it was opposed not only by Republicans, but by New Deal Democrats. McCarthyism was eventually rejected by both parties, and the Watergate scandal eventually generated a bipartisan opposition that led to Nixon's resignation. In each of these cases, then, the guardrails eventually held. So for more than a century, for 120 or so years, our system of checks and balances worked pretty well. But again, it worked well not because of the Constitution, not only because of the Constitution, but because our constitutional system of checks and balances was reinforced by norms of mutual toleration and forbearance. Now, we argue in the book that America's democratic norms have been unraveling over the last quarter century. There were signs of this as early as the 1990s. Newt Gingrich, who became House Speaker in 1995, began in the late 80s to instruct his Republican allies to use terms like betray, anti-flag, anti-family, and traitor to describe the Democrats. In other words, Gingrich encouraged his fellow Republicans to adopt a strategy of mutual intolerance. Gingrich was also a master of constitutional hardball. He engineered the first major government shutdown in the modern era in 1995. Basically, the idea was, if the president doesn't give us what we want, we will stop funding the government. Just shut it down. Technically legal, but an incredibly reckless precedent to set. 3 years later, the Republican House carried out a partisan impeachment of Bill Clinton, basically on a technicality. It was the first impeachment in the United States in 130 years. But the process of norm erosion really took off in the 2000s. The rise of the Tea Party movement in particular radicalized the Republican Party, encouraging Republican politicians to abandon mutual toleration. So you saw Republican leaders like Gingrich, Sarah Palin, Rudy Giuliani, Mike Huckabee telling their followers, beginning in 2008, over and over again, that President Obama did not love America, that Obama and the Democrats were not real Americans. The birther movement, including Donald Trump, took a step further. They questioned whether Barack Obama was born in the United States, and therefore they challenged his very legitimacy as President of the United States. Colorado Congressman Mike Kaufman, a Republican, declared, for example, and I quote, "I do not know if Barack Obama was born in the United States of America, but I do know this. In his heart, he's not an American. He's just not an American." Member of the House of Representatives. Hillary Clinton received similar treatment. Following Trump's lead, Republicans across the board referred to her as a criminal, chanting "lock her up" live on national television during their national convention. Now, America has always had an extremist fringe, but this was no longer fringe politics. These were national Republican leaders. This was the party's 2012 vice presidential candidate. It was the party's 2016 presidential candidate. It was the National Republican Convention live on primetime television. Leading Republicans were now denying the legitimacy, or at least questioning the legitimacy, of their Democratic rivals. That worries us, because in the absence of mutual toleration, politicians start to abandon forbearance, and politics descends into an escalating spiral of constitutional hardball. When we view the other guys, when we view our partisan rivals as enemies, as an existential threat, we grow tempted to use any means necessary to beat them. And that is exactly what's starting to happen. Politicians on both sides of the aisle have started to throw forbearance to the wind. When Republicans won control of Congress in 2010, they adopted a strategy of outright obstructionism. They basically tried to ruin Obama's presidency in order to win in 2012. Filibuster use reached an all-time high. There were more filibusters during Barack Obama's second term than in all the years between World War I and the end of the Reagan presidency combined. President Obama responded to obstructionism with constitutional hardball of his own. When Congress refused to pass immigration reform, refused to take action on climate change, he circumvented Congress and made policy via executive orders. That action was technically legal, but it clearly violated the spirit of the Constitution. By the end of the Obama presidency, Republicans in particular seemed willing to use any means necessary to prevent Democrats from winning. More than a dozen states, every one of them led by Republicans, adopted strict voter ID laws aimed at dampening turnout among poor, non-white voters, overwhelmingly Democratic voters. In North Carolina, after the Democrats won the governorship in 2016, the lame duck Republican legislature passed in a sort of a surprise emergency session a series of laws aimed at tilting the playing field. They packed the local election boards, they prevented the new governor from replacing Republican appointees, and they reduced the size of the state Court of Appeals by 2, essentially stealing 2 court seats from the incoming governor. Most stunning of all, though, at least in my opinion, was the Senate's decision not to allow President Obama to fill the Supreme Court vacancy created by Justice Scalia's death. That move was not even allowing hearings, was unprecedented since 1866. So the problem is not just that Americans elected a demagogue in 2016. It's that we elected a demagogue at a time when the soft guardrails protecting our democracy were becoming unmoored. Now, that doesn't mean our democracy is doomed, but it does mean our institutions are more vulnerable than they used to be. The most dangerous scenario, in my view, and this is the one thing that keeps me up at night, is a scenario of a major security crisis, either a war or a large-scale terrorist attack similar to 9/11. President Trump's approval rating is 42% today. President with 42% approval is a lot less dangerous than a president with 70 or 80% approval. Leaders like Putin, Alberto Fujimori, Hugo Chavez, Erdogan, Duterte in the Philippines were all able to subvert democratic institutions in part because they were massively popular. 70 or 80% of the electorate, of the society, backed them. And many of these guys, almost all of them, became massively popular in the wake of a major security crisis. For Fujimori, it was the Shining Path guerrillas. For Putin, it was a series of terrorist attacks in Moscow. For Erdogan, it was a combination of terrorist attacks and a coup attempt. George W. Bush, as you remember, saw his approval rating shoot up to 90 or 91% following the 9/11 attacks. For a few weeks, for a couple of months after 9/11, George Bush could have done almost anything he wanted. Checks and balances basically melted away. To his great credit, President Bush exercised a lot of forbearance. He did not use his institutional prerogatives as weapons against his opponents. Donald Trump, by contrast, is not a man of forbearance. What he would do in the context of a major security crisis is anybody's guess. My guess is that he would do what he's done what he's done with other political opportunities, and that is exploit it to the hilt. That could easily put our institutions at risk. Now, the chances of America facing a major security crisis under President Trump are not trivial. The United States has fought a major ground war or suffered a major terrorist attack under 6 of its last 12 presidents. I'm not great at math, but that's 50%. So how do we get to this point? Why are the soft guardrails of our democracy coming unmoored? Danley and I argue that what's destroying our democratic norms is polarization. Republicans and Democrats have come literally to fear and loathe one another. In 1960, a survey found that 5% of Republicans and 4% of Democrats said they would be unhappy if their kid married someone from the other party. 5%. Today that number is 50%. 50% would be unhappy if their kid married someone from another party. According to a recent Pew survey, I think from last year, 45% of Republicans, 41% of Democrats say the other party's policies threaten the nation's well-being. 49% of Republicans and 55% of Democrats say the other party makes them afraid. We have not seen this level of partisan hatred since Reconstruction. And this is not just traditional liberal conservative polarization. People do not fear and loathe one another over taxes and health care. They don't. Today's partisan differences run much deeper than that. They're about race, religion, and our way of life. Our parties have changed dramatically over the course of our lifetimes. Back in the 1960s and the 1970s, the Republican and Democratic parties were different on a bunch of issues, but culturally and demographically, they were almost alike. Both parties were overwhelmingly white and Christian. 3 changes have occurred, 3 fundamental changes have occurred over the last 50 years. First of all, the civil rights movement led to a massive migration of Southern whites from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party, while African Americans, newly enfranchised in the South, flocked to the Democratic Party. Secondly, over the last 50 years, the U.S. experienced a massive wave of immigration. Most of those immigrants and their kids ended up in the Democratic Party. And third, since Reagan, evangelical Christians have flocked overwhelmingly to the Republican Party. Back in the 70s, there were more evangelicals in the Democratic Party than in the Republican Party. They were pretty evenly split. Today, they're almost all Republicans. So today, very different from 50 years ago, Democrats and Republicans are racially and culturally very distinct. The Democrats are kind of a rainbow coalition of urban, educated whites and a range of ethnic minorities. The Republicans, by contrast, remain overwhelmingly white and Christian. So what? Why does that matter? Well, white Christians aren't just any group. They were once not only an electoral majority, but they used to sit unchallenged atop this country's social, cultural, economic, and political hierarchies. They filled the presidency, Congress, Supreme Court, governor's mansions. They were the pillars of local communities. They were the CEOs. They were the newscasters, the sports stars, the movie stars, the college professors. And they were the face of both the Democratic and Republican parties. Those days are obviously over. But losing a majority, and crucially, losing one's dominant social status, can be deeply threatening. Many Republican voters, not all, but many Republican voters feel like the country that they grew up in is being taken away from them. And that, we think, is ultimately what fuels polarization. The problem is that extreme polarization can kill democracies. This is a major lesson that we took from the failure of democracy in Europe in the 1930s and in Latin America in the 60s and 70s, when politics is so deeply polarized that each side views a victory by the other side as something that's intolerable, beyond the pale. Democracy's in trouble. When an opposition victory becomes intolerable, you start to justify taking extraordinary steps, extraordinary measures to prevent the opposition from winning. Things like violence, election fraud, coups. Now, Americans have not reached that point. But we have reached a point where, according to exit polls, exit polls in 2016, 1 out of 4 Trump voters, 1 out of 4 Donald Trump voters believed that he was unfit for the office of the presidency of the United States. 1 out of 4 Trump voters, people who pulled the lever for Donald Trump, did not believe he was fit to be president, and yet they still preferred him to the Democrat. We've reached a point where, according to Gallup polls over the last 18 months, Republicans have a much more favorable view of Vladimir Putin than of Hillary Clinton. Those are dangerous levels of polarization. Those are dangerous levels of polarization. Donald Trump is a symptom of that polarization. He's not a cause of it, and his departure will not put an end to it. So what can be done? I have no idea. That's the end of my talk. No, I got to earn my cookie. It's a hard question. For one, it is clear that the Republican Party has to change. It has to become a more diverse political party. As long as it remains an overwhelmingly white and Christian party in a society as diverse as ours, and growing more diverse, it will be prone to polarizing white nationalist extremism. Now, the roadmap for the Republican Party becoming more diverse, for reforming itself, has already been drawn up. It's not by me, but by the Republican Party itself, in its post-2012 autopsy report that was written after Obama's re-election. The party leadership commissioned a study to sort of ask the question of why the Republicans had lost 2 elections in a row, and they came up with a 90-page report that reads a little bit like Chapter 9 of our book. It basically says the Republicans have to become a more diverse party. It needs to appeal to young people, needs to appeal to women, and it particularly needs to appeal to ethnic minorities. Unfortunately, Donald Trump pushed the Republican Party in exactly the opposite direction. Now, in terms of what Democrats can do, here I'm going to say things that are a little more controversial. There's been a lot of talk in progressive circles about the Democrats having to learn how to fight like Republicans. If Republicans are going to play constitutional hardball, if they're going to steal Supreme Court seats, then Democrats have to play tit for tat. If they don't, they will be victims of an endless series of sucker punches. Political scientist David Ferris just published a book called It's Time to Fight Dirty. And Ferris says in this book, he explicitly makes a call for Democrats to engage in constitutional hardball. He says Democrats should adopt a strategy of procedural warfare. They should pack the Supreme Court when they get the chance. They should use obstructionist tactics to grind Congress to a halt. He even says they should break up California into 7 states in order to manufacture a Democratic majority in the Senate. Go check it out. It's true. It's a whole chapter on breaking California up into 7 states. Now, that may seem a little bit loony, but Democrats are in fact learning how to fight like Republicans. Earlier this year, they used the filibuster to engineer their own government shutdown. That's right out of the Newt Gingrich playbook. Some Democrats this year are running on a platform of impeachment. They're saying, elect me and I'll impeach Trump. And if Democrats win control of the Senate, something that's possible, not that likely, but possible, there's talk of denying President Trump the ability to fill any more Supreme Court vacancies, just like the Republicans did to Obama. We think this is a terrible idea. If Democrats respond with constitutional hardball, it will reinforce and it will accelerate the process of our country's norm erosion. In other words, it will further corrode our democratic guardrails. And in our experience, studying other democracies in crisis, that sort of escalation rarely ends well. Responding tit for tat may feel good, it may feel just, it may be just. But once that process of escalation begins, it becomes very, very difficult to stop. It is a death spiral, and it can kill a democracy. It killed democracy in Spain in the 30s, in Brazil in the 60s, in Chile in the 70s, Turkey over the last decade. So Democrats should avoid constitutional hardball for the sake of democracy. But I want to suggest that they also have a self-interested reason, a selfish reason, for preserving democratic norms. They don't have to be altruist. They don't have to take it for the country. It's good for Democrats to engage in forbearance. As David Frum has argued, Republicans are playing dirty because they're desperate. Because as the GOP is currently constituted, its medium-term electoral prospects are really bleak, right? Being a white Christian party in 2030 and 2040 in this country, not going to go well. So according to Frum, this is another book that another rival book that you can go order on Amazon. My publisher's going to kill me after this talk. Republicans are operating with very short time horizons. It's basically win now at any cost and the future be damned. If you're a party with a white Christian identity and a growing bunker mentality, that might make sense. But Democrats are in a very different place from that. Democrats' medium-term electoral prospects are much better. Thing is, if we wreck our democracy in the short term, there will not be a medium term to enjoy. So Democrats have an interest in preserving our core democratic institutions. Playing recklessly with our institutions is not the way to do that. In the meantime, I think there are at least two things that Democrats can do. First is to take steps to reduce inequality. Levels of income inequality in this country are higher than at any time since before the Great Depression. Between 1975 and 2015, the bottom 40%, it's a lot of Americans, the bottom 40% of American society saw its income stagnate. No gains over 2 generations. At the same time, top 5% has seen its income nearly double. Rising inequality, dramatically rising inequality, has created a profound sense of unfairness among many Americans. And that sense of unfairness has clearly fueled racial resentment. There's no question that rising inequality and declining social mobility have contributed both to polarization and to right-wing populism in this country. The Democratic Party basically stopped talking about inequality, stopped talking about sharing the wealth in the Clinton era, in the 1990s. It should take up those issues again. Our democracy may depend on it. Another thing that we can do, the Democrats can do, that we all can do, is get more Americans to vote. As all of you know, turnout in this country is abysmally low. Over the last quarter century, turnout in presidential elections has averaged 57%. Turnout in midterm elections is less than 40%. In other industrialized countries, in countries like Australia, New Zealand, Denmark, Sweden, Israel, South Korea, Belgium, Finland, turnout is between 75 and 85%. 80% of the electorate votes. There is some evidence that boosting turnout would help to reduce polarization. It may be, at least partially, a cure for polarization. Why is that the case? The people who vote in American elections, the 1 out of 2 people who vote, are those who are most committed to one of the partisan poles. The people who stay home, by and large, are the people who don't care very much about politics. They don't care very much about either party. But democracy, it turns out, needs those people, because less committed voters have a depolarizing effect on elections. So we need to boost turnout. Unfortunately, Republicans are doing just the opposite. They've spent the last decade in state after state after state making it harder for people, especially poor people, to register and to vote. If you're looking for a cause, this is a good one. Making it easier for people to vote is not only inherently democratic, but it may help to reduce the polarization that has begun to threaten our institutions. We cannot take American democracy for granted any longer. It is true that no democracy, even remotely as old or as wealthy as ours, has ever broken down. But it is also true that we are now in uncharted territory. Levels of income inequality are reaching unprecedented levels. And we've begun a transition that, to my knowledge, no democracy has ever successfully undergone. One in which a previously dominant ethnic group loses its majority status. Now, we may well be the first democracy to do it. I think there are good reasons to believe that our society, that our democracy is fully capable of making that transition. But it's clear that we're going to have to pass through a period of intense and polarizing reaction before we get to that shore. During that moment of polarization, which we are now in, we cannot afford to be reckless with our institutions. We have far, far too much to lose. I'll stop there. Thank you.
We hope you've enjoyed this replay. Please tune in again next Thursday to hear the debate on voting rights from our 2019 series. The subject could not be more current. Thank you for coming.